You ever had the experience of standing out when all you wanted to do was blend in? Or been in a place where standing for who you are means that you are alone in the crowd? We are going to look at a story today of three young men who found themselves in just such a situation. We have been following the story of Daniel. And we today have gotten up to chapter 3, and up to this point, the first two chapters have focused primarily on Daniel himself. His three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, have been kind of in the background. But in chapter 3, they become front and center as we hear their story and the challenge that they faced. Just to get you familiar with it, I've asked if Sean Stanton would come and read the story for us.
Daniel chapter 3 from the New Living Translation. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messages to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king! You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God who we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, O majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their house will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon.
The day came that Leroy decided he needed to settle on a career. And because his Uncle Jeb owned a trucking company, he decided that maybe he'd learn how to be a big rig driver. So he went to truck driving school. He did really well. He passed all the exams with flying colors. The day came that he graduated, and he went to Uncle Jeb, and he said, "Uncle Jeb, I'd like to be a driver for your company." Uncle Jeb said, "Well, Leroy, you know, that's a pretty big responsibility. Having an 18-wheeler out there on the open road and carrying freight, and other people's lives literally can be in danger. I'm not sure that you're really ready for that kind of responsibility." Leroy said, "Uncle Jeb, I did really good at school. You can ask me anything. I think I know the answer." So Uncle Jeb started asking him questions. And he asked him about engine maintenance and compression ratios and how to secure a load and all kinds of technical questions. And Leroy had the answers. He was ready. And Uncle Jeb says, "Well, Leroy," goes, "there's one more thing." He says, "You got to know. It doesn't matter how much book learning you got. Sometimes when you're out there, things happen. There are split-second decisions that have to be made, and people's lives are on the line." So let me just give you an example. So let's suppose that you and your cousin Clem are long hauling for me. You're driving, Clem has gone back in the sleeper, and he's asleep behind you. So it's just you. You've got to make the decision. You're on the road, and you come to a place with about a 6% downhill grade. You're heading down the grade, and at the bottom, there's a 1-lane bridge that goes across a deep ravine. And as you start down the grade, what are you going to do? Leroy says, "Well, Clem, I'm going to downshift. And put the brakes on." He says, "Well, that's what you think, except you discover your brakes have gone out and you don't have any brakes now, and you can't get that truck to downshift. You're picking up speed, you're heading toward a 1-lane bridge down a 6% grade at the bottom, and you look up the other side, and you see there's another truck the same size as you coming down to 6% grade. He's going as fast as you are, and you realize the two of you are going to meet on that bridge over the ravine. What are you going to do, Leroy?" Leroy thought for just a second. He said, "I'm going to wake up Clem." Uncle Jeb said, "You're going to wake up Clem." He says, "Good grief, man. You're going down a 6% grade, a 1-lane road toward a single bridge at the bottom where we're a deep ravine and a truck that's out of control with no brakes, no truck coming at you, and you're going to wake up Clem?" He says, "Well, yeah, because he ain't never seen a wreck like what this one's going to be." The story of Daniel 3 sets up what appears to be certain disaster. We have two opposing forces that are headed toward a collision that it seems they cannot avoid. Except that in this story, it doesn't appear, at first glance, that this is two trucks of equal size. This looks more like a Peterbilt versus a Prius. 3 Hebrew slaves who are facing the emperor of the most powerful empire on earth. The narrator wants us to understand that the conflict these three young men are facing is not just a fender bender of values, but it is a head-on collision between worldviews, and lives are literally at stake. Everything about this story says that the stakes are big. The statue itself is massive. We're told that it was 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, made out of gold. After the dream we talked about last week, remember where Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of a giant statue, and then a stone comes out of nowhere and hits it in the feet and destroys everything? I have a feeling that he reinforced the feet on this statue. But here's this giant statue, and the list of guests is very prestigious. It is a who's who of power and position. You get the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, all the officials of the provinces, all have come to the dedication of this image. In fact, just in case you missed the list, he gives the list again. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, all the officials of the province, all have gathered for the dedication. In fact, you're going to see quite a bit of repetition in this passage. And the repetition is intentional. It is to help emphasize and build up the magnitude of what is going on here. Their ceremony itself is immense in its pomp, in its grandeur. He says, a herald proclaims, you are commanded, people and nations and languages, everyone, the whole earth. And when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music. And again, when the people heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped. Everything about this communicates grandeur. Well, everything except the bagpipes. But anyway, that's another issue. The problem we really have isn't so much this giant statue. The real problem is one man's hubris. Nebuchadnezzar. It is really his ego, his pride. We find back in chapter 1 that Nebuchadnezzar is the conquering hero. He has taken over Judah along with multiple other kingdoms, and he has taken the best for himself. That is how these three young men come to be in Babylon. They were among the best and the brightest in Jerusalem, and Nebuchadnezzar took them for himself. Everything that Nebuchadnezzar had to look at proclaimed that he was the greatest. Chapter 2, we find that Daniel has come to interpret the king's dream. You recall that. And the king said, well, not only do I want you to interpret the dream, but you have to tell me even what I dreamed. I'm not going to tell you that. It was a test to see if people really had some kind of connection with God or the gods, as Nebuchadnezzar thought of it. And Daniel revealed that the dream that had Nebuchadnezzar so troubled, that was keeping him awake at nights, was a dream about a massive statue that is destroyed and turned to nothing. And Nebuchadnezzar has this ominous feeling. It says something about him and about his power. And for Nebuchadnezzar, his power, his status was the all-important thing. And so in chapter 3, we come back to a giant statue, but this time it's not a dream statue. It is a real statue. And whatever insight or turmoil his dream might have raised in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, apparently enough time has passed that he has set it aside and he is back to pursuing things that exalt his greatness, his majesty. It's interesting we don't really know what the idol was. It just calls it an image. We don't know if it was an image of Nebuchadnezzar himself or if he had set up an image to one of the Babylonian gods. Marduk would be a great option. He was the chief god of Babylon. Perhaps that's what the statue was. But I think the reason the narrator doesn't bother telling us what the image was is because the image wasn't really the problem. The problem was Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, I mentioned repetition. You see this in the way the image, the way Nebuchadnezzar is described. Check this out. Verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. The image King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The image King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The image Nebuchadnezzar set up. The golden image Nebuchadnezzar set up. The golden image King Nebuchadnezzar set up. The golden image you, Nebuchadnezzar, have set up. The golden image that I, Nebuchadnezzar, have set up. The image that Nebuchadnezzar have made. Get the message? Nebuchadnezzar, this is about you and your pride and your arrogance. 9 times it's repeated. Right alongside this pride, we find some of pride's best friends: jealousy and anger. Jealousy. We read that the Chaldeans, these were the magician class among the Babylonians, that some of these Chaldeans are the ones who actually turned in the Hebrews, who said, hey, they're not bowing down when you said they're supposed to bow down. It says they did this maliciously. This wasn't just an innocent observation. They weren't just trying to be helpful. They meant to do harm. Well, how come? Why would they want to harm Daniel's friends? Well, if you go back to Daniel chapter 1, verse 20, you recall that God blessed them and that they excelled in their studies. They were taught in the ways of the Chaldeans. And when they were tested, the king found that they were 10 times better than all of their competitors. Well, you can imagine how well that set. For Chaldeans that grew up priding themselves on their arts and their ability to suddenly have foreigners who don't even worship their gods come in and beat them out in their own course of study, that did not make them friends. Or chapter 2, we have where Daniel has interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream successfully. Nebuchadnezzar is very pleased. He rewards Daniel. And in the process of Daniel being rewarded, Daniel makes a request. He made a request that he appoint Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. So Daniel, in what I guess we would say an act of nepotism, right? When people use position to help their friends get position, uses his moment of good favor in the king's eyes to get favor for his friends. And if there's one thing that nepotists don't like, it's when other nepotists beat them out. And the Chaldeans are not happy because they thought they had this special place with Nebuchadnezzar. Those should have been their positions. And now these foreigners are taking their positions. And so, if you can't use your influence to get ahead, then use your guile to drag them down. They go to the king. There are certain Jews that you've appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. You notice how the focus of their comment is all about you, Nebuchadnezzar? They're not so much worried about the fact they're not serving the right gods. In fact, they don't say our gods, which they could have said. They say, no, they don't pay attention to you. They don't serve your gods. They don't worship the image that you have set up. Nebuchadnezzar, these people are a direct challenge to your greatness. Well, Nebuchadnezzar is furious. Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commands that they be brought. And the key phrase, I think, to this passage falls in verse 15. Nebuchadnezzar challenges these guys. He says, I'm going to give you one more chance to do it right. And if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? That's the key phrase. Nebuchadnezzar says, do you understand how great and powerful I am? There is not a God that can deliver you from me. So you better get your act together and get on your knees when I tell you to get on your knees. Well, again, using repetition, the narrator makes a point that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are the guys in the spotlight right now. In fact, 12 times they are named. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on, 12 times. The author's setting this up. Here is Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar. And on the other side, it's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these two are coming into collision. It is a confrontation between the ego of this seemingly limitless power of an emperor versus the faith and conviction of three young men who seem powerless. If Nebuchadnezzar were drawing up his organizational chart right now, here's what it would look like. At the top is Nebuchadnezzar, below that is any god that might get in his way, and below that, way below that, is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego drew the organizational chart just a little bit differently. It looks kind of like this. Yeah, we are under you as long as you're under God, but we are directly under God. And if there's a conflict between these two, our first responsibility is to please God. Well, there is some brave talk here. Verses 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." Can you imagine what that just did to Nebuchadnezzar's blood pressure? You don't need to answer me? So we don't need to answer you. If this be so, your threat to throw us into the furnace, to incinerate us, if that be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. Remember what he just said? He goes, what God is there that can save you from me? And they say, well, our God can. Our God could deliver us from you. But, O king, if not, be it known to you that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. We know there is a God that is bigger than you, and we know that he can rescue us. But even if he doesn't rescue us, that doesn't change anything. I think it's interesting to look at how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego chose to take their stand. On the day of this ceremony, these guys appeared to have gone to the ceremony like they were summoned, with all the other officials. They went. They apparently stood through all of the ceremony. They listened to the music. They listened to the speeches. They apparently were respectful. They weren't in agreement, but they were respectful. They weren't holding up picket signs. They weren't banging pots and pans, trying to make a scene. They simply stood there. But when it came time to bow, they simply refused to bow. Again, they didn't make a huge commotion. They weren't yelling. They weren't shooting off flares. In fact, it appears that the king wouldn't even have known that they hadn't bowed if it wasn't for those jealous enemies that came and told him. But when the time came to state clearly what they believed, although they were willing to be respectful, they were willing to even be quiet. When it came to the challenge and Nebuchadnezzar said, "You bow or else," they stated clearly and with conviction that they would not do it without apology. I've thought about this often when I think about how I, as a follower of Jesus Christ, should live in an increasingly secular culture. How do I stand? How do I resist things that I say as a Christian I cannot go along with? And I'm not saying at all that Christians shouldn't make public protest. We live in a society far different than Babylon. We are given free speech. We are allowed to make our opinions known. And I think we should exercise that and seek to do it appropriately for righteous causes. But I also think it's worth prayerfully and thoughtfully considering how and when and where we take those stands. That we conduct ourselves in ways that are a credit to Jesus Christ, that show respect wherever we can show respect, but also show clear conviction when needed. And that's not to say that if we do it well, we won't face opposition or even persecution. And the fact that we may be called upon at some point to stand for our convictions, even if we do it well, doesn't mean that we won't lose favor, and that losing favor doesn't mean that we're wrong. The fact that people don't agree or that they get angry at your position doesn't mean you necessarily are wrong. These three Hebrews had experienced much of God's favor and blessing. They had made it up the organizational ladder. They had been promoted. But when it came down to it, they didn't base their decisions simply on retaining favor. It wasn't a political calculation of how do I hang on to what I've gotten. They recognized that choosing for God was not a guarantee of a happy ending. While they had faith that God could deliver them, they also recognized that that might not be how it played out. And that was not a condition of their disobedience. They hadn't already talked to God and said, okay, God, you pull us out of this and we're your men. They said, no, we're your men whether you pull us out or not. It doesn't always result in a happy ending. Speaking of unhappy, the king is definitely unhappy. Leroy, wake up Clem. The king, we're told, started out in a furious rage. These three Hebrews stand up to him and tell him they don't have to give him an answer, and they're not going to bow, and he now is furious squared. He is filled with fury, and his face was changed. I think that is really an interesting phrase. His face was changed. As me and a chaplain, I went to some training a couple years ago, and it was on critical incident stress management. So what happens to you when you're involved in critical traumatic incidents, and how do you manage that for yourself? And there's a whole section talking about the effects of adrenaline, what happens when adrenaline starts pumping. And, there's a lot of physiological things that happen. And one of those is that your mental faculties actually become impaired. You've heard people probably talk about being in a crisis situation, and it's like they just couldn't think. I've been with people in situations where they couldn't think of their own phone number because they're under so much stress. And the capillaries in your extremities begin to close down. Your body is actually pooling blood towards your core, taking it away from your extremities because your body's getting ready for a fight to the death. And it's trying to minimize the amount of blood that is out here in the extremities where you may get hurt, and it's trying to make sure your core functions keep working, keep you alive. Adrenaline does all these amazing things. And our instructor, as she was talking about this, she got talking about dealing with angry people. And she said, I would not be afraid of someone who is red with fury. We talk about someone that's just red in the face, mad. She said, that isn't the person that scares me. Says the person that scares me is the person who is white with fury. Because what that tells me is that they have gone into a complete adrenaline mode. They're not thinking clearly. Their body is actually drawing blood away from the extremities because they're getting ready for a fight or flight reaction. She goes, the person who is white with rage is the person that you should be afraid of. I think Nebuchadnezzar, his face changed. I think this guy went from being red hot to being white hot. And in fact, he wants his incinerator made white hot. You might wonder why there was a big furnace sitting right there. Well, most likely the furnace was the smelter they had used for working all of the gold that was involved in the statue. It's still there, it's still burning. He says, well, make it hotter. Make it 7 times hotter. So hot that when the guards try to throw them into it, it says that they are killed by the heat blasting out of it. That smelter probably looked like a beehive. It was designed with an opening at the top where you could throw in the metals that you were working on, in this case, 3 Hebrews, and there would be a viewing port in the side where you could see what was going on inside the furnace. When these men approached that chimney at the top, there was so much heat blasting out of it that they were killed. The image that's drawn is one of absolute hopelessness. Here is the most powerful man on earth who is on the verge of having a stroke from his own rage, who has a massive furnace superheated to an inferno, 3 doomed captives that are tied head to foot, In fact, bound up so tight and thrown in so quickly, it makes a point of saying that even their hats were thrown in. He wants nothing left of these three. It appears that there is no way out. Those of us in Washington, if we're Seahawks fans, still dealing with the bitterness of the 2019 season. But one of the things we're known for is the 12th man. We're the 12s. 11 men on the field playing the game, but there's this other factor. It's the fan in the stand that is helping to push the team toward, we hope, victory. The 12th man. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it wasn't the 12th man that made the difference. It was the 4th man. The narrator has overwhelmed us with these repetitions. The king, the king, the king, the image, the image, the image, the crowds, the crowds, the crowds, the fire, the fire, the fire. And then suddenly, without any fanfare, a new character steps on the stage and changes everything. King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, rose up in haste, declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." Well, he said, "I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." So who was the 4th man? Nebuchadnezzar says it looks like a son of the gods, whatever that looks like. Or he says it looks like there's an angel that has been sent. Some people think that this is an Old Testament instance of Christ appearing. We don't know. It may have just been an angel, if you can say just an angel. Whoever that 4th man was, though, the message is loud and clear. These 3 young men are not alone in the furnace. God is intervening. You remember the God that Nebuchadnezzar said, "What God can deliver out of my hands?" Yeah, he has shown up in the furnace. And I think it's interesting to note that they were free in the midst of the fire. You know, God could have done this other ways. I mean, he could have just extinguished the flames before they ever got in there. He could have struck Nebuchadnezzar dead as soon as he made the pronouncement. The guards could have run away, and the 3 men could have escaped. And yet, that's not what God chose to do. He didn't deliver them before the fire happened. The freedom was found in the midst of the flames. But here's the deal. They weren't alone in the flames. God did not leave them alone. And their freedom was not something that Nebuchadnezzar gave them once they got out. Even in the flames, Nebuchadnezzar says, these guys are free. They're walking around. I don't know what kind of furnace maybe you feel you're in. But I just want to remind you that as a follower of Jesus Christ, you are not alone. Whether he saves you from the fire or he saves you in the fire, you're not alone. The Apostle Paul said this in 2 Corinthians. He says, "We know that when this earthly tent we live in is taken down, that is, when we die and leave this earthly body, we will have a house in heaven, an eternal body made for us by God himself and not by human hands. We grow weary in our present bodies. We long to put on our heavenly bodies like new clothing. Whether we are here in this body or away from this body, our goal is to please him." Paul says, whatever the circumstance, whether I'm here and I'm in a body that's wearing out and I get tired and I get sick and I hurt, but I know that whether I'm here or whether I'm away, the goal is still the same. Like those 3 young men, we believe our God can deliver us, but whether he delivers us or not, it doesn't change anything. And the fact is, when all is said and done, we are with him. Well, their faith is recognized, it's honored, it's validated. They're actually promoted rather than being destroyed. And I think this story definitely speaks to us when we find ourselves in situations where our allegiance to Christ is being challenged. It can feel lonely when everyone around you in those situations seems to demand compromise. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they model wisdom and courage to be respectful where you can, to quietly stand and be willing to speak with clear conviction when you're challenged. I think it also speaks with a lot of encouragement when we are in the fire, whatever the situation is that has landed us there. The furnace that you face, maybe it's physical suffering. You've been to the doctor, and he has given you a diagnosis that seems hopeless. Medicine says there is no way out. Or maybe you're not the one who is sick. Maybe it's someone that you're caring for, and their health is failing. It's a parent, it's a spouse, someone else. Maybe it's attacking their mind. They don't even recognize you now. And you think to yourself, there isn't any way that I can get through this. You can be a young parent. All of us who have had kids probably remember those times when you think that you will never see a good night's sleep again. And you're not quite sure you're going to get through this phase of life, whatever that furnace is. And I know what we all do when we hit those things. When we see those flames, whatever they may be, our prayer is always, God, please deliver me. Just let the baby sleep through the night. Just have the doctor give me some good news. Just turn around this financial disaster. Just save my family from this pain. God, please make it go away. And that's a good prayer. God isn't put off by that prayer. God wants us to come with honesty. Jesus himself prayed that kind of prayer. Remember the night in the garden before he's to be crucified? He prays this. He fell on his face and prayed, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." There's nothing wrong with praying to be delivered from the flames. But if he doesn't keep you from the flames, don't forget the fourth man. Don't forget that he has not left you. King David in Psalm 23, he says, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil because you are with me." I don't know about you, but I would prefer not to go through the valley of the shadow of death. I would like to detour around it, fly over it, not go in there to begin with. And yet David says, even when I have to pass through the valley, I've often pondered the fact he says, though I walk. If I have to go through it, I just as soon run and get through it quickly. But he says, sometimes you have to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. He says, even there, I will fear no evil. Why? Because of the fourth man. Because you are with me. Hebrews 13, verses 5 and 6. He has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? So here's the prayer that I've started praying for myself and for others. Lord, let them see the fourth man. Let them know they're not alone. Do I pray for the bad situation to go away? Of course I pray for that. But if the bad situation is something that God wants them to pass through, wants me to pass through, then Father, please help us to see the fourth man. Help us know that you are with us even in it. I'm going to finish on a somber note, because for many Christians today, the story of Daniel 3 is not a metaphor for suffering, but it is a literal life and death reality. Pastor Lawan Ndimi is a Nigerian pastor. Maybe you've heard his story. He was kidnapped in early January. This month, Boko Haram kidnapped him. And when they released his ransom video, Pastor Ndimi used it as an opportunity to share his testimony of his faith in Jesus. Here are a couple things that came out of that. He said, in all conditions that one finds himself in, it is the hand of God. By the grace of God, I will be together with my wife and my children and all my colleagues. If the opportunity has not been granted, maybe it is the will of God. Kind of sounds like those three young men, doesn't it? I believe my God can deliver me. But even if he doesn't, God is still faithful. God is still there. This past Monday, January 20th, Pastor Ndimi was executed by his captors because he refused to recant his faith. But the fourth man was still there. I got an email this week from Dan Brown, one of our global workers. He forwarded from one of his co-workers, and I just want to share it with you. He says, my best friend from Yemen, Ashraf Aziz, a dear brother, has been captured by the rebels and charged with treason. That just means he doesn't agree with their evil ideology, and he was brave enough to say so publicly. Now he's being held in prison awaiting trial in a Sharia court. If found guilty, the penalty would likely be death. We've offered them money. We've offered them a deal, but they're not interested. They want blood. If I could, I would go there and trade myself for him, but I could never reach the place where they have him. Friends, we need to pray for Ashraf. He is a shining star in a dark land. He is very brave, but he has a young wife and 2 little girls at home. I am sure they are scared. We're going to pray for Ashraf right now. Because for him, this sermon literally is life and death. Let's pray. Father, I pray for Ashraf. I pray for his wife. I pray for his little girl. Lord, I really can't wrap my mind around what the thoughts, the feelings, the fear has to be for your family member, for yourself to be in this kind of situation. But Father, I ask that you would let them see the fourth man. Our prayer, God, is that you would set Ashraf free. Whatever that requires, Lord, we would ask you for some miracle that would let him be reunited with his family. God, we would pray for joy to come out of this great sadness. But I pray for Ashraf today, Lord. I pray that you will give him courage. Whether your will is to set him free or not, oh God, may he know that you are with him. May his wife, may his daughter know that you have not forsaken them, whatever the outcome. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm going to ask the men to come forward. We're going to take communion this morning. Communion is the reminder for us who are followers of Jesus that the fourth man has gone before us. Jesus Christ has stepped into the furnace before we ever had to face it. He said, this bread symbolizes my body broken for you. This cup represents my blood shed for you. Jesus has already faced the worst thing that Ashraf's captors can do to him, and he has conquered it. Death is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end. It is the beginning of the beginning. And so as you take communion this morning, I would encourage you to just spend some time thanking him for being the one who is in the furnace with you, whatever the furnace is. Maybe pray some more for Ashraf. And give thanks for what these simple elements mean. As you're ready, just take the bread and the cup in your own time. And when we're finished, the worship team will come back up and we'll close this.